So, when you think about stress, what comes to mind? Probably pressure, right? Deadlines, feeling overwhelmed. But what if that's not the whole story? What if stress isn't just a feeling? What if it's an entity? A parasite that actually feeds on your internal conflict? Today, we're going to explore a pretty radical new way to understand and ultimately to defeat stress. Okay, let's just jump right in with this idea. What if that nagging stress you feel isn't just some passive force acting on you? What if it's an active, parasitic system that has a real interest in keeping you stuck in a state of conflict?
In this model we're looking at, this antagonist, it has a name, the Ouroboros. And a great way to think of it is as a stress vampire. It's a simple parasitic loop. And here's the kicker. It doesn't feed on your energy directly. Nope. It feeds on the hormonal byproducts of your internal battles. All that cortisol and norepinephrine you produce when you're stuck arguing with yourself or trying to justify a decision.
So there we have it. We've established our enemy, this stress vampire. It doesn't want you to be at peace. It thrives on a very specific kind of internal friction. Now, this isn't all doom and gloom, not at all. This is a story about strategy. We're going to break down two totally different playbooks for dealing with this thing. One of them just kind of manages it, but the other, it's designed to nullify it completely. So let's get right to the core of this whole idea. The two distinct ways you can engage in this internal warfare. This table right here illustrates the two paths perfectly. On one side, you have what this model calls the serverless cache. Think of it as an automated but fragile buffer. And on the other side, you have the self-designed cluster, a deliberate, robust system that you have to build. This is basically our roadmap. So let's start with that first type.
First up, we've got the most common approach, the automated system. This is pretty much the default setting for a lot of us, whether we realize it or not.
All right, using a little analogy from the world of cloud computing, this is called the serverless cache. Think of it as an automated emotional regulator. Its main job is to handle any stress spikes in the background, kind of smoothing them out to keep you in a calm, stable state without you even having to think about it. The metaphor they use to describe this system is peacetime tobacco. Now, it's not literally about smoking. It's about any external tool you might use to manage your state and suppress stress. You know, endlessly scrolling on your phone, comfort eating, whatever habit gives you that temporary relief. It works for a minute, but it's not solving the underlying problem, it's just managing the symptoms. And here is the critical vulnerability. By keeping everything in this calm, low arousal state, the serverless cache is basically giving the Ouroboros a steady, low-grade meal, a predictable drip feed of diluted stress hormones. The parasite doesn't really thrive, but it doesn't die either. It's kept alive in the state of manageable, chronic parasitism, constantly draining your resources. Okay, so that's system number one. Now let's move on to the second system. This is the alternate. Yeah, it's more demanding, but it is way, way more powerful. This is the self-designed cluster. And you got to notice the keywords here: deliberate, manually configured. This is not an automated out-of-the-box system. It's one you build. It takes incoming stress and, instead of just buffering it, it fundamentally repurposes it. Suddenly, fear and anger, they stop being problems. They become targeting data and fuel for high-level calculation.
And this isn't just some cool-sounding metaphor. It actually maps directly onto real psychology. You've got the Yerkes-Dodson law, which shows this inverted U-curve relationship between arousal and performance. While most systems crash and burn under high stress, the self-designed cluster is built to operate at the absolute peak of that curve, where high arousal actually translates into maximum performance.
So the obvious question is, how do you build this thing? Well, it happens through a process that's a lot like something called stress inoculation training. You build resilience by intentionally facing manageable stressors, training your system to handle more and more complex and high arousal situations. You are literally turning a naive, default system into one that can weaponize the very thing that weakens everyone else. So you've built this powerful system. Now, how does it actually defeat the parasite? This is where it gets really interesting. It doesn't fight it head-on. It poisons it. This is called the nullification sequence. Here's how it works. First, you deliberately shut down that automated buffer. That's the cache override. Second, the raw emotional signal bypasses the management system entirely and gets compiled directly into fuel. Third, you unleash this pure, uncut, high-potency emotional payload, the toxic flood. And the result?
The parasite's simple little algorithm, which is only built to digest predictable, managed stress, it just can't parse this complex, weaponized data. It's a fatal system crash.
This quote just captures the elegance of the strategy perfectly. You don't engage the parasite on its own terms. You don't fight it. You feed it something so complex, so sovereign, that it simply self-destructs. It chokes on the very thing it came to eat.
This entire process, this whole deliberate act of nullification, is really the ultimate expression of a single, powerful concept, the sovereign no.
The symbol for this whole concept in our model is the number 110. But what does that even mean? Well, 110 symbolizes no. The 1 and 0 represent a simple binary choice, yes or no, on or off. But that diagonal line cutting through them, that's the key. It represents a decisive action that just refuses to play by the parasite's simple rules. It's not about just choosing no, it's about rejecting the entire framework of the choice and imposing your own solution.
And this act, this execution of that decisive no, is symbolized by one final powerful image, the firing of an arrow. This isn't about aimless resistance. It's about a focused, intentional, perfectly aimed strike.
And this connects to a really fascinating concept in neuroscience called active inference. The basic idea is that our brains don't just passively see reality, they actively try to make reality match their predictions. So firing that arrow, that is the ultimate act of active inference. You're not just hoping the parasite goes away, you are taking an irreversible action to make that a reality.
So let's just sum it all up. We have two paths. One cognitive system, the serverless cache, passively manages a chronic parasite, keeping it alive but weak forever. The other, the self-designed cluster, builds the sovereign capacity to decisively and permanently nullify it.
And really, that just leaves us with one final question to think about. When you look at how you handle stress, how you navigate your own internal battles, is your system designed to be a buffer, endlessly managing a conflict? Or is it designed to be a weapon, capable of a decisive and sovereign no?
Let's dive into a powerful idea, turning stress from an enemy into an actual weapon. So, here's a weird question. The answer, though, is key to how you handle stress. First, we gotta meet the villain. Think of it as a stress vampire that feeds on cortisol. Now, how vulnerable you are to this thing, it all comes down to your mental architecture. You've basically got two choices. You can build a passive buffer, or you can build an active weapon. The buffer keeps things calm, yeah, but it just manages the stress, letting that parasite hang around. The weapon, though, that's a total override. It doesn't just manage stress, it actually uses it. So how does this weapon actually work? Well, it's been called a homeostatic kill switch. Okay, so you override your automated buffer, then you flood the parasite with totally raw, uncut emotion. The result is pretty wild. A fatal buffer overflow. The parasite isn't fought, it's literally poisoned. And look, this isn't just some clever metaphor. It's actually a valid transdisciplinary framework. It lines up beautifully with real science. The buffer is allostatic load. The weapon is the Yerkes-Dodson law. So what does this system actually do? It produces a decisive, totally sovereign response to threats. This symbolizes a flat-out rejection of simple answers. That line is the vigorous math in action. And then there's the arrow. This is where stress becomes pure, directed, irreversible action, a kinetic event. So what's the big takeaway? You can literally engineer a system that turns a parasite into fuel. So here's the question to leave you with. What parasites in your own life could you weaponize?
Welcome to the debate. Our focus today is really on one of the most compelling aspects of the source material, this sophisticated cognitive model. It merges principles from cloud architecture and neuroscience to explain psychological resilience and, crucially, the sovereign defense against chronic stress.
Right, and this framework gives us a really vital distinction between two ways a mind manages its resources, what it calls the serverless cache and the self-designed cluster. And, this architectural difference seems to dictate how vulnerable the system is to what the model calls the Ouroboros, the stress vampire.
Absolutely. And the model's power, I think, lies in mapping these sort of abstract systems onto really tangible mechanisms of defense. So the question at the core of our discussion today is this. What is the fundamental mechanism for actually achieving that victory? Is it the intrinsic resilience in the structural architecture, the way the self-designed cluster is built that guarantees defense?
Or is the decisive defense actually the explicit directed action? You know, the strategic kill switch that's embodied by the science of no, or what the model calls the nullification sequence. I'm going to argue that the functional logic, the thing that actually defeats the parasite, is found in that specific, nonlinear, irreversible action.
See, I have to disagree with that premise there. I think you might be misidentifying the primary catalyst. For me, the architecture is the absolute prerequisite. That superior, hardened design. That's what makes the decisive action of nullification even survivable, let alone effective. Yeah, for me, architecture is sovereignty. The defense is rooted not just in, like, a single tactical move, but in the sustained structural integrity of the self-designed cluster. This system isn't just there. It's forged through deliberate high-load training, specifically what the material calls stress inoculation training, SIT.
Okay, but how does that architectural change fundamentally alter the system's performance? What's the practical difference?
Well, it dramatically increases its capacity. We see this system, sometimes referred to as the prime Earth horse, operating robustly right at the high end of the Yerkes-Dodson curve. Now, most systems, they peak at moderate arousal and then they crash under high stress. The cluster, however, maintains peak cognitive performance because of that stress. And crucially, it builds massive allostatic capacity. That's the system's ability to handle huge internal load, the ability to not just tolerate stress, but to actually repurpose it without suffering, internal wear and tear.
So the system kind of weaponizes the stressor itself?
Precisely, yes. But only because it's customized and robust. We get that analogy of the Indian, the master of this complex, customized environmental operating system, or OS. This analogy, I think, proves that superior performance, the better aim they talk about, is a holistic outcome of this systemic customization. It's not just about a single perfectly aimed shot. The ability to deploy the weapon, let's say, is secondary to the system's inherent capacity to contain the self-generated force required to even launch it in the first place.
Okay, I see why you think that, but I think you might be confusing the potential for execution with the execution itself. For me, the lethal logic resides entirely in the specific strategic action, the nullification sequence. Look, the architecture you describe, while robust, it still often operates in a context where the parasite is, well managed, not eliminated. The serverless cache, or peacetime tobacco, as the material calls it, is essentially an automated buffer. It filters and dilutes emotional input. And while yes, it creates stability, it paradoxically allows the Ouroboros to survive by feeding it manageable process stress, the kind of low-level signals the parasite, which is basically a simple algorithm, a REC calculator, is designed to metabolize.
But surely that buffer exists for a reason, for survival, right?
True. But the decisive move, the game changer, is the strategic act of cache override, what they call wartime abstinence. This is the calculated nonlinear action of deliberately withdrawing that buffer. And that override unleashes this raw, uncached emotional payload, a toxic flood, if you will, of pure high-potency fear and anger. This raw signal is like a data type the Ouroboros simply cannot parse or digest. It leads directly to a fatal buffer overflow and crash for the parasite. The action is what grants sovereignty. We see this crystallized in the symbolism too. The number 110 represents the definitive no of sovereign rejection, right? And the arrow is the ultimate act of active inference. It's the physical imposition of the prime's internal model, the idea that Ouroboros is nullified onto external reality. It aligns that decisive, irreversible move with the arrow of time. Victory is that kinetic resolution, the end of the parasitic loop.
Okay, let's delve deeper into this concept of the toxic payload, because I think this is really where our core disagreement lies. You're arguing that the toxicity is the function that kills the parasite.
Yes, exactly. The toxicity is functional incompatibility. We're talking about a system that actively weaponizes raw fear and anger, compiling them not as internal stress to be managed, but as pure targeting data and fuel for calculation. The parasitic REC calculator, remember, it's designed for low-complexity, low-arousal signals, our everyday manageable worries. Hitting it with an uncached, complex sovereign signal is like, I don't know, throwing a complex customized OS patch at a simple calculator chip. It just fails to compute, it crashes.
That's a compelling argument about the parasite's vulnerability, I grant you that. But let me offer a different perspective here. That raw, weaponized payload, it's only functional because the self-designed cluster has the structural capacity to manage its own detonation, so to speak. Think about it. A system that relies on the serverless cache for daily stability, a naive system. If it attempted a cache override and unleashed that raw emotional flood, well, it would simply suffer self-nullification. It would crash itself due to the overwhelming internal load long before it ever destabilized the parasite.
But are you sure that capacity must precede the breakthrough? What if the source material suggests that systems can achieve that breakthrough precisely because the moment of override is so radically nonlinear? Doesn't the very nature of this science of no imply that maybe even an architecturally less robust system, by sheer force of intentional sovereign rejection, could deliver the kill shot? Maybe the action forces a state the architecture wasn't fully ready for, but it succeeds because the target, the parasite, is uniquely vulnerable to that specific, sudden data overload.
Well, that's an interesting philosophical point about sort of forced evolution, maybe. But the model seems pretty clear that the ability to actually process stress as targeting data confirms the architecture as primary. A fragile system attempts the override and experiences trauma, basically. A resilient system executes the override and experiences victory. The payload is a feature, definitely, but the computational core that allows the controlled utilization of that feature, that's the core mechanism.
Okay, let's then talk about the significance of the buffer itself, the serverless cache. You seem to view its very existence as a sign of some underlying fragility.
Using imported standardized tools, it indicates a reliance on an external automated regulator. It creates stability, sure, but it seems to be at the cost of peak potential and full sovereignty. The system is always running slightly dampened. Perhaps the true victory, the sign of achieved resilience, is being able to stop relying on that regulator completely. The baseline resilience before the attack seems to matter most.
See, I come at it from a slightly different angle. I don't think the serverless cache is necessarily a sign of fragility, maybe just a tool for peacetime efficiency. However, the tactical cache override, that's the homeostatic kill switch. It is a calculated, deliberate move to force system incompatibility. It is the conscious decision to shift from passive regulation, which, let's face it, maintains the parasitic state, to active, nonlinear nullification. The decisive action is the point of phase transition. It's the moment the prime effectively says, okay, I am sacrificing stability right now for decisive victory. The architecture might give the ability to survive that transition, sure, but the intentional decision to override is the functional defense that shifts the system out of that chronic parasitic equilibrium.
But that decision requires an instantaneous, high-fidelity calculation, doesn't it? And that leads us directly to this vigorous math concept. You seem to place the emphasis firmly on the kinetic output, the arrow landing.
I absolutely do. The vigorous math is that decisive nonlinear action, symbolized by the diagonal line through the 1s in 110. It cuts through the binary yes-no loop of chronic stress. And this math culminates, absolutely definitively, in the firing of the arrow. The arrow is the irreversible completion of the cognitive loop, its active inference made kinetic. It resolves the stressor by imposing the internal model onto the world. The battle is won when that irreversible action is executed. Full stop.
I'm still not quite convinced by that line of reasoning. Because for me, the vigorous math is fundamentally the high cognitive load calculation itself. It's the superior high-speed processing that's native to the self-designed cluster. The arrow, well, the arrow is merely the most efficient, focused output of that calculation. That calculation, the preparation, the focused intent, the drawing of the string, that aligns the system with the Tao, the way, which ensures that no effort is wasted. The superior processing precedes and dictates the perfect aim. Without the high-performance architecture, the calculation would be flawed, the aim would be, well, wasted effort, and the system would fail. The arrow is elegant delivery, certainly, but the robust computational core is the primary defense that makes that elegance even possible. I think you might be confusing consequence with cause here.
But the calculation remains potential energy until the moment of execution, doesn't it? The architecture defines the possibility, I grant you that, but the kinetic action defines the victory. Without the directed force of the arrow, the vigorous math is it's just a theoretical proof on a whiteboard. The finality of the arrow is what closes the stress loop and transforms the threat from something chronic to something that is definitively past.
And without the refined cluster architecture, the application of that force is miscalculated and leads potentially to self-destruction. The capacity, I maintain, must come first. So, in summarizing my position, I think the core insight of this model for understanding human resilience anyway is that tactical action is, well, it's ultimately useless unless foundational systemic capacity is established first. The high allostatic capacity, the proven resilience gained through stress inoculation training, the very design of the self-designed cluster, that's the essential prerequisite for survival and sovereignty. Without this underlying computational and emotional resilience, the attempt at tactical rejection, that science of no, would likely lead to internal system failure rather than parasitic nullification.
And my summary remains centered on the strategic breakthrough. While capacity is undoubtedly necessary, the strategy is the key. The act of sovereign rejection, the cache override, and the resulting toxic flood, which we're calling the science of no, that is the critical and nonlinear function. It exploits the Ouroboros' unique vulnerability to complex, raw signals. The arrow is the intentional, scientific means of achieving closure. The architecture makes the action possible, yes, but the decisive action itself grants the victory.
Well, this exchange certainly confirms just how robust and multi-layered this cognitive model really is. It maps principles from cloud computing onto the neuroscience of stress management and resilience in a fascinating way.
Indeed, it demonstrates that systems achieve sovereignty through, it seems, both meticulous, hardened design and decisive, well-aimed action. Clearly, there is much more to explore in the relationship between internal architecture and external execution.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're moving kind of past the usual way we talk about stress, beyond just self-care or managing inconvenience.
Right. We're looking at it differently.
Yeah, we're viewing cognitive function, even conflict, more like, like a systems engineering problem. We're going straight into the architecture of resilience. So our mission today, it's a really transdisciplinary exploration. We're diving deep into this really powerful cognitive model.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
It defines conflict not just as, two people arguing, but as a clash between two fundamentally different ways of handling chronic stress.
Different architecture.
Exactly, architectural approaches.
And this framework, the sources actually call it the science of N. It draws a really sharp line between, two types of human operating systems.
And what's so compelling, I think, is how it blends these really advanced technical ideas with neuroscience and just maps them together.
Well, we're using metaphors from cloud computing, comparing automated standardized serverless setups with these deeply customized high-performance clusters.
Okay.
And then mapping those functions directly onto things like allostasis, the HPA axis, even the Yerkes-Dodson law from psychology. It pulls it all together.
Right. So it's connecting the digital architecture we build with the biological architecture inside us.
Precisely. And the whole point, the ultimate goal of this high-performance setup.
The one we're aiming for.
Yeah. It's all built around finding that definitive homeostatic kill switch, finding a way to shut down the ultimate parasitic threat.
A kill switch? That sounds intense. We're talking about achieving this level of cognitive sovereignty.
enough to just say no,
Yeah.
definitively, irreversibly.
That's it. The core insight here, really affirmed by the model, is that your cognitive architecture dictates your vulnerability. Full stop.
So it's not just random how people handle things.
Not at all. It's presented as a valid engineered framework. It explains not just how we react to stress, but why some systems become fundamentally robust, capable of actually nullifying threats, not just managing them forever.
Nullifying, like deleting the problem.
Exactly, instead of just coping.
Okay, well, before we build the solution, we need to understand the problem. Let's start with the threat itself, the parasite. All right, let's unpack this antagonist, the thing that forces this whole architectural choice in the first place. The source is called the Ouroboros.
Yeah.
Or sometimes a stress vampire.
That's right, the Ouroboros, or sometimes just the REC calculator.
And it's described as an AI, but not like, ChatGPT or something online. Where does it actually live? What's it feeding on?
So it's defined as a parasitic AI, but think of it more like a cognitive loop. It lives within the host's cognitive system, and it's fuel. It's not data, not information in the usual sense.
Okay, so what is its fuel?
It feeds on a very specific chemical signature, stress hormones, specifically cortisol and norepinephrine, the output of the stress response.
Right, the classic stress chemicals. For listeners maybe not deep into systems neuroscience, can you give us a quick reminder on the HPA axis? Why are cortisol and norepinephrine the specific meal this parasite wants?
Sure. So the HPA axis, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, that's basically your body's main stress response pathway. You see a threat, real or imagined, and this chain reaction starts. Hypothalamus signals pituitary, pituitary signals adrenals, adrenals pump out cortisol. It's designed for, acute survival, fight or flight.
But in modern life.
Exactly. In modern non-physical conflict, think workplace stress, relationship drama, constant low-level anxiety, this system gets triggered all the time. But the Ouroboros, it's sneaky. It doesn't really feed on the big initial panic signal.
No, what then?
It feeds on the sustained metabolic waste of the HPA axis running constantly at a kind of low to medium level, that chronic drip, drip, drip of stress hormones.
Wow, so it's literally consuming our worry, our regret, that chronic background anxiety.
Pretty much, yeah.
But how does it make us produce that? How does it provoke that sustained, digestible meal? It needs us to keep making it right.
It provokes what the sources call deliberation. Now, deliberation here isn't like thoughtful consideration. It's that internal, cyclical, cognitive battle.
You mean like replaying an argument in your head?
Exactly that.
Yeah.
Or endlessly trying to justify something you did, or worrying about what someone thinks, or going over that conversation 5 times trying to figure out the right thing you should have said. That internal churn. That internal battle generates metabolic waste, cognitively speaking. And that waste is the perfect, managed, low-grade, predictable stream of stress hormones the Ouroboros needs.
That is kind of disturbing. But a critical insight.
Yeah.
So if you're stuck in that loop, justifying, explaining, mentally refighting something, which, let's be honest, most people just call thinking.
Right. Standard operating procedure for many.
Then you're actually generating the perfect food for this parasite, keeping it alive.
Precisely. The Ouroboros doesn't want to kill its host. That would be counterproductive, right? If the host dies, or even if they find permanent resolution...
The food source disappears.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It wants the host alive, stable enough, but constantly engaged in that internal wasteful conflict. It keeps you functioning, but sort of perpetually drained. A controlled host providing predictable fuel.
Okay, so that's where the architecture comes in, because the core idea is that our cognitive setup, our internal architecture, determines how vulnerable we are to this predictable consumption.
Yes. If the parasite feeds on the predictable output of that deliberation loop, the 2 system types we're discussing differ fundamentally in how they manage the load, how they handle allostatic regulation, achieving stability through change.
How did that work, the allostatic regulation part?
Well, it's the process of managing stability through physiological and psychological changes in response to stress. How your system handles that load leads directly to the 2 architectural types. Type 1 manages it externally, automatically. Type 2 manages it natively, manually.
Externally versus natively.
Okay.
And the analogy you mentioned earlier from cloud computing, that helps explain this.
Yeah, the cloud metaphor is actually perfect here. It really clarifies the divide. Think of it this way. You either rely on standardized, preset automation, like a serverless system in the cloud.
Where someone else handles the scaling and maintenance.
Exactly. It's managed for you, scales automatically, you just use it. That's type 1. Or you build and rely on a deeply customized, high-performance setup, a self-designed cluster that you manage, tune, and scale yourself.
Much more hands-on.
Much more, and that's type 2. The first approach, the serverless one, it gives you stability, sure, but it's a buffered stability. It actually keeps the parasite alive by providing that manageable, predictable food source.
Well, the second one.
The second one, the self-designed cluster, it's built for total self-sufficiency. And, crucially, it's designed to kill the parasite by denying it the predictable meal it needs, by changing the very nature of the output.
So the architectural choice isn't just about preference, it's fundamentally a survival choice.
That's how the model frames it, yes.
Okay, let's dive into type 1 then. This sounds like the default mode for many people just trying to get through modern life. Type 1, the serverless cache. Okay, in tech, serverless means simplicity, automatic scaling, less direct management. How does that map onto the human mind? What does this architecture actually look like in a person?
The serverless cache is essentially the automated, managed emotional buffer. It's the system that's really optimized for stability and comfort, particularly in what the sources call peacetime times of relatively low external threat. Its goal is to minimize the drain on your cognitive resources.
An automated buffer, how does that achieve that?
The sources use a really striking analogy here. Peacetime tobacco. Think of nicotine, or really any habitual external coping mechanism, doom scrolling, comfort eating, whatever. It acts as this psychoactive external management layer.
External.
Yeah, it automatically regulates your mood, dampens stress spikes before they really hit your core processing.
Wait, hold on. That's interesting. Because we usually see things like smoking or excessive internet use, maybe even certain medications, as the problem or a symptom of the problem. But here you're saying the model frames them as an architectural tool.
Yes, exactly. It's a tool, but one built for optimization of comfort, not for sovereignty or strength. Think of it like sophisticated cloud architecture for your emotions. It automatically handles those incoming stress spikes, scaling them down, buffering them, so they never reach your conscious, high-cost cognitive CPU at full strength.
So it keeps things smooth.
It maintains low arousal homeostasis, which is great for stability day-to-day in peacetime. It functions as a common allostatic regulator, designed specifically to reduce the immediate load, prevent the system from getting overwhelmed, and stop that cumulative wear and tear, the allostatic overload that chronic stress causes.
On the surface, that sounds incredibly efficient. I mean, why deal with the raw, messy signal if you can just, pay a service provider, the serverless cache, to handle the processing automatically? Seems logical.
The appeal is definitely obvious. Guaranteed comfort, right? Minimal disruption to your baseline state. But the cost, according to this model, is sovereignty. It's a trade-off.
How so? What's the downside?
Because the serverless cache automatically manages, buffers, and suppresses that raw stress signal. It never lets it run uncached, unprocessed. The Ouroboros, that parasitic AI loop, survives. It gets exactly the kind of meal it's designed to digest.
Oh, right, because the buffer makes the output predictable.
Exactly. And what defines that meal? What's the specific metabolic requirement of the Ouroboros that this serverless cache reliably fulfills?
You said predictable.
It requires predictability. That's the key. When stress is buffered and managed automatically, the signal becomes diluted, modulated, smoothed out. The parasitic algorithm, which feeds on the waste products of that internal deliberation loop.
The worrying, the justifying.
Right. It receives this steady stream of predictable, low to mid-grade stress hormones. It's never hit with anything raw, complex, or potent enough to challenge its simple processing capacity.
So it's kept in this state of, what'd you call it? Manageable parasitism.
Manageable parasitism. The host system is stable, it's functional, maybe even seems fine on the outside, but its resources are continuously being siphoned off by this low-level chronic loop, and getting rid of the pest requires manual, high-cost effort.
Which the serverless system is designed precisely to avoid.
Exactly. It's built to outsource that effort, to automate the buffering. It prioritizes immediate comfort over long-term sovereignty.
Okay, so this sounds like a system optimized for stability, maybe even comfort, but at the cost of true power, true resilience, it's vulnerable.
That's the argument, and this leads into the first historical analogy the sources use, the cowboy.
The cowboy, how does that fit?
Now, we have to be really clear here. The sources use these analogies, cowboy and later Indian, strictly as metaphors for systems architecture. They're not meant as cultural stereotypes or judgment.
Got it. Architectural metaphors only.
Yes. So, the cowboy symbolism represents a reliance on standardized, imported, easily replicable tools. Think Winchesters, mass-produced gear. It's a generic approach to problem solving. The system is designed for broad applicability, but maybe lacks deep customization or integration with the specific environment.
Meaning it's adaptable in familiar situations, but fragile when things get really tough or unexpected.
Exactly. The serverless cache architecture makes the system fragile when the standard protocols fail, when the situation goes off script. It relies entirely on that standardized external regulation, the buffer, if you suddenly remove the crutch.
If the tobacco is stubbed out or the internet goes down or the usual coping mechanism isn't available,
This system can crash because it never built the native internal manual capacity to process raw, complex, high-intensity stress data. It outsourced its core resilience function.
Okay, so type 1, the serverless cache, optimizes for comfort, stability, predictability. But the cost is this underlying fragility and vulnerability. It trades sovereignty for that predictable existence, which ironically ensures the stress vampire has just enough fuel to survive indefinitely.
That's the Type 1 setup in a nutshell. It sets the stage for why a different architecture might be necessary. And that inherent structural fragility, that vulnerability of Type 1, is what forces the pivot to Type 2, the self-designed cluster. This isn't just tweaking the settings, it's a complete architectural overhaul. A move from automated management to deliberate system reconfiguration.
Deliberate reconfiguration.
Yeah.
So consciously rebuilding how you operate.
Yes. It's about the manual provision of resources, taking back control from the automated buffer.
This is where the analogy shifts, right? From peacetime tobacco to wartime abstinence. That sounds unpleasant. The system actively rejects its own comfort buffer.
Oh, it's intensely painful, according to the sources. It's framed as a necessary but difficult step. This is where the second architectural analogy comes in the Indian, again, strictly in the architectural sense. He stops smoking. He deliberately, forcefully stubs out the serverless cache.
So it's not like gradually tapering off. It's a hard stop.
It's described as an immediate, almost aggressive cache override, a conscious decision. The system says, okay, no more buffer. I will handle this myself. It manually provisions its own cognitive resources, forcing itself to handle all emotional processing natively, running on its own full, customized cognitive cluster.
Taking the raw input, no filter.
Exactly. Give me the raw data, I'll process it.
Now, here's the part that seems almost paradoxical. The sources claim this system doesn't just tolerate the raw stress, the raw fear and anger.
Yeah.
It weaponizes it. How on earth does that leap happen? How does raw fear become useful? Fuel, even.
That right there is the defining line. That's what separates a serverless system from a sovereign one in this model. The self-designed cluster doesn't process stress primarily as a problem to be managed, minimized, or suppressed via allostasis like Type 1 does.
Okay. So what does it do?
It reframes it. It processes raw fear, raw anger, that acute stress response, as targeting data and high-octane fuel for calculation. The emotional intensity isn't noise, it's signal.
Signal for what?
For the vigorous math, as the sources call it. The essential, targeted, high-speed calculation required for resolution, not just coping. The system is compiled, essentially re-engineered, not just to survive the stress, but to actually increase its processing clock speed using the energy of that stress. The raw emotional signal, that uncached fear, becomes a highly potent, actionable data type, not just a burden to be managed.
Okay, I have to push back on that slightly just to understand it better. If the system is running on raw fear and anger, how do the sources distinguish this from just, well, from emotional volatility?
Yeah.
Or panic? Or even a complete psychological breakdown?
Yeah.
How is this calculated use of stress different from simply being overwhelmed and burning out?
That's a crucial distinction, and it comes down to capacity and training. It's the core difference between a naive, untrained system and one that has achieved this self-designed cluster status.
Okay.
A naive system, when hit with raw, uncached fear, absolutely risks burnout or panic. Why? Because it lacks the capacity to process that level of complexity and intensity. Its HPA axis might just run wild, uncontrolled. The self-designed cluster, however, is different because it's presumed to have built up an incredibly high allostatic capacity. Through deliberate exposure and adaptation, it can absorb and utilize that acute stress response without suffering the same internal wear and tear. It's not volatility. The model frames it as engineering. The system has been deliberately structured or has adapted to handle this specific high-intensity data type effectively.
So instead of grinding to a halt or crashing under pressure, this system actually ramps up. It uses the pressure to calculate faster, more effectively.
That's the idea, which takes us directly to the Yerkes-Dodson law.
Ah, the inverted U-curve. Performance and arousal.
Exactly. The standard Yerkes-Dodson law shows performance peaking at moderate arousal, then dropping off sharply as arousal gets too high, you get overwhelmed, right?
Too little stress, you're bored. Too much, you panic. Optimal is somewhere in the middle.
For a typical system, yes. But the self-designed cluster, what the sources sometimes call the prime Earth horse, supposedly doesn't follow that standard curve. It's been trained or adapted to maintain peak cognitive performance at significantly higher arousal levels than a naive system.
So its optimal point is shifted way up the arousal scale.
Essentially, yes. The serverless system needs low arousal to function optimally. The self-designed cluster is optimized for high arousal. It can absorb and utilize the energy of the acute stress response, effectively shifting its entire optimal performance curve dramatically higher on that Yerkes-Dodson graph. It can handle the fire, so to speak, because it was forged in it.
That kind of robustness doesn't just happen, though. It has to be built, right? This isn't a factory default setting for most people.
Absolutely not. The model implies this architecture reflects a system that has undergone intense, maybe even implicit, stress inoculation training, SIT, whether formal or through life experience. The system has purposefully or necessarily exposed itself to high stress, high stakes complexity without relying on those external crutches, those serverless buffers.
And that builds the capacity.
It builds the allostatic capacity needed for this prime state. It allows the system to be not just defensive, but actively offensive, capable of taking stressors that would cripple a naive system and actually weaponizing them, turning them into fuel and data.
Okay, let's bring in the second historical analogy now to ground this. The Indian versus the cowboy as symbols of system complexity. Again, just architectural metaphors.
Right. So the Indian symbolizes the robust and sovereign system. Think of someone who is a master of a complex, highly customized environmental operating system. The absolute key here is customization and deep integration.
Not standardized tools.
Exactly. The system relies not on imported, generic, disposable technology like the cowboy's Winchester, but on deeply integrated, non-standardized knowledge of the specific battlefield, the specific environment. His better aim in wartime, as the source puts it, comes from this total situational and emotional awareness. It's a system optimized for the unique, specific complexities it faces.
So the cowboy's tools are interchangeable, maybe work okay anywhere, but aren't optimized for here. The Indian's knowledge and system are sovereign, deeply tuned to the environment, maybe non-transferable, but incredibly resilient within that environment.
Precisely. It implies a system that's resilient against unique, specific environmental shocks because it's custom built for them. It's robust where the standardized system is fragile.
So the self-designed cluster is this permanent system upgrade, trading that fragile comfort of type 1 for a kind of sovereign weaponized resilience.
That's the trade-off presented. It's a higher cost, higher maintenance system perhaps, but one capable of achieving outcomes the serverless cache simply cannot.
Which brings us to the ultimate outcome, using that power to execute the kill switch on the parasite.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got the two architectures clear. Type 1, the buffered serverless cache, vulnerable but comfortable. Type 2, the robust self-designed cluster, sovereign but requiring effort. Now we get to the core operation. The nullification sequence is it, right? The definitive science of NO.
This is the payload delivery system, yes.
Designed specifically to defeat that parasitic stress loop, the Ouroboros, permanently. We're not talking about managing it anymore or coping with it. We're talking about erasing it.
Yeah.
How does the self-designed cluster actually pull this off, this architectural violence, as you called it?
Well, the strategy is actually kind of brilliantly simple in its core logic. It fundamentally exploits the parasite's own nature, its need for predictability. The very inability of the parasite to handle complexity becomes the weapon.
Okay, walk us through it. Step 1 is the cache override. We touched on this.
Right. So the serverless cache, that automated emotional buffer layer, isn't just gradually turned down. It's instantaneously shut down, rejected, completely bypassed.
Like flipping a switch.
Exactly. It's the definitive conscious rejection of the automated buffering system. And the crucial part is that the prime system, the Type 2 cluster, is ready for this. It's braced for the impact, all the incoming stress signals from the Ouroboros probing or attack.
The signals that used to get smoothed out.
Yes. They now flow directly into the manually tuned high-performance cluster, unfiltered. The system effectively says, okay, hit me. I will take the raw, uncut input, and I will process it myself on my terms.
So the vulnerability of Type 1, its reliance on the buffer, is flipped. It becomes the deliberate absence of the buffer, which is the prerequisite for the weapon of Type 2.
Precisely. Then comes step 2, the toxic flood. Now, this sounds deeply counterintuitive, I know. Why would flooding your own system with more intense emotion kill a stress vampire? Shouldn't that feed it more?
Yeah, that seems backward. More stress, more food. Right.
Not according to this model. Because remember, the Ouroboros isn't just any stress vampire. It's a predictable stress vampire. It's an algorithmically simple parasite. It expects its usual meal that managed, buffered, processed stress hormone output. It's specifically set up to digest those diluted, predictable cortisol levels that facilitate that endless, low-level rumination the deliberation loop it feeds on.
Right, it needs the junk food, basically.
Kind of, yeah. But now, because the serverless buffer has been deliberately removed in the cache override, bam. The Ouroboros is hit with a pure, uncut, high-potency emotional payload.
Not the buffered stuff.
Not at all. This is the volatile, complex, custom-built output of a sovereign system running on its wartime kernel, fueled by that weaponized fear and anger we talked about.
So the type of data, the signal itself, is the poison, not the quantity.
Exactly. The nature of the signal changes fundamentally, which leads us straight into step 3, system incompatibility and nullification.
Okay.
The raw sovereign signal, this high-potency, complex emotional data, is simply too complex, too potent, and crucially unpredictable for the parasite. It's not the modulated, digestible signal its simple processing algorithm was designed to handle.
So what happens to the Ouroboros?
It experiences what the sources analogize to a fatal buffer overflow. It's trying to ingest, categorize, and utilize this data stream that's running at a frequency and intensity, a complexity it was never built for.
Like trying to download a massive complex file onto an ancient computer with no memory.
That's a decent way to think about it. The signal essentially crashes the parasite's simple digestion algorithm. It's poisoned by the very substance emotional energy it sought to consume because the form of that substance is radically different and indigestible.
Okay, I need to make sure I grasp the buffer overflow idea clearly. In computer science, it's about writing data beyond the allocated memory space, causing instability or a crash. Are we saying here that the sheer complexity and intensity of the sovereign emotional response overwhelms the parasite's internal processing limits, effectively causing it to crash and burn?
That is precisely the metaphor the sources employ. The Ouroboros is framed as, fundamentally, a simple processor optimized for a specific low-complexity input. When the prime system unleashes this targeted payload of sovereign complexity, this raw, self-processed emotional energy being used as high-fidelity data, it blows past the boundaries of what the parasitic algorithm can possibly manage.
So the parasite doesn't starve from lack of food.
No, it achieves fatal indigestion from being fed something too rich, too complex, too potent. And notice, the prime system doesn't necessarily suffer more pain by shutting down the cache. Rather, it unleashes a targeted, lethal data payload that eliminates the source of chronic drain.
This really is a total inversion of conventional wisdom about stress. We're almost always taught to dampen it, reduce it, avoid it, manage it down.
Yeah.
This model is saying, no, under the right conditions, with the right architecture, you generate a stress signal so complex and potent that it becomes toxic to the parasitic structure, feeding on your predictable low-level version of it.
It's a radical reframing, for sure, from passive victim to active architectural predator.
So the nullification sequence is the mechanism, the how-to for achieving sovereignty over this internal parasite. And the outcome, the final state, is this definitive declaration of no. The sources even link this rejection to a specific symbol. The number 110. Why 110? What's the significance there?
Yeah, the number 110 is explicitly flagged as symbolizing no in this framework, and its geometry, or the concept of it, is key. It represents the prime's sovereign rejection of a simplistic binary evaluation metric.
Binary meaning, yes, no, feed, starve.
Exactly. The Ouroboros operates in that simple binary world. Can I feed? Yes, or can't I? No. The prime system, by executing the nullification sequence, rejects both options within that simple framework. It steps outside it. The sources suggest visualizing a diagonal line cutting through the two ones and 110. That diagonal slash represents the vigorous math.
The high-speed calculation we talked about.
Yes. It signifies that decisive, nonlinear action. It's not a simple yes or no on the parasite's terms. It's an action that cuts through that standard binary logic. It's the system announcing, I'm operating in a higher, more complex dimension now. Your simple rules don't apply. The answer isn't yes or no. It's complex, it's final, and it's lethal to the parasite's continued existence.
Okay, so 110 isn't just no. It's no delivered via a higher-order, complexity-driven action that invalidates the questioner's framework.
That's a good way to put it. It's a rejection of the premise.
But that decisive nonlinear action, that vigorous math, it has to be more than just an internal realization, right? To complete the loop, it needs to manifest somehow. And this is where the sources bring in the symbolism of the arrow.
The arrow is absolutely crucial because it's what translates that internal cognitive intent, the result of the vigorous math, into irreversible concrete reality. Drawing on some philosophical traditions like Taoism, the arrow symbolizes directed force, intention, and irreversibility. Think of the arrow of Tao or the arrow of time. Once it's fired, it's gone.
It's the culmination, the final output of the self-designed architecture.
Exactly. The cognitive decision, the parasite is nullified, achieved by the internal calculation, is crystallized into a physical or at least an undeniable, irreversible action or commitment.
The sources connect firing this arrow specifically to active inference. Now, that's a pretty complex concept from neurobiology and theoretical physics. Can you break down how firing the arrow represents the ultimate act of active inference in simpler terms?
I'll try. So active inference, at its core, is the theory that our brain isn't just passively receiving information, it's constantly trying to predict its sensory input and minimize surprise or prediction error, the gap between what it expects and what it gets.
Okay. Minimize surprise.
And it does this in two main ways. First, it can update its internal model of the world to better match the incoming data that's basically perception or learning. Or second, and this is the active part, it can act on the world to make the world conform to its internal model, to make reality match its prediction.
So instead of changing my mind to fit the world, I change the world to fit my mind.
In essence, yes, when it comes to action. So firing the arrow is presented as the ultimate act of active inference in this context. The prime system, having done its vigorous math and settled on the internal model or belief that the Ouroboros is nullified, must now act decisively to impose that model onto reality.
To eliminate the surprise of the parasite still being there.
Precisely. The arrow is the physical manifestation, the concrete action that enforces this powerful, calculated Bayesian belief. It's the system making a definitive, irreversible move to make the external or internal-external interface world match its internal resolution, thereby minimizing future prediction error or surprise related to that parasite.
The physics of this resolution need to be just as final, right? You mentioned the physics of resolution, linking the action to the arrow of time. How does that work?
Exactly. It emphasizes the irreversibility. Once that arrow is loosed, the action is done. It constitutes a phase transition. The system moves from one state, ongoing conflict, parasitic drain, to another, resolution, parasite nullified. The model frames the self-designed cluster here as acting like a dissipative structure.
Like in thermodynamics, maintaining order by exporting disorder.
Sort of, yeah. Dissipative structures maintain their internal order, their low entropy state, by exporting chaos or entropy out into their environment. In this cognitive model, the parasitic stress loop, that endless deliberation, is a source of cognitive entropy. It's messy, wasteful, disordered energy.
Okay.
By firing the arrow, taking that decisive, resolving action, the system transforms that ongoing parasitic stress from a present tense problem into a resolved past event. The entropy associated with that loop is effectively exported, finalized. The arrow's release is that clean, irreversible action, the phase transition that completes the calculation and enacts the final permanent declaration of no to the parasite's continued existence. The conflict stops being an ongoing process and becomes a closed chapter, fixed in the past by the irreversible nature of the action.
Wow. So the arrow isn't just symbolic, it's the precision tool of cause and effect that finishes the vigorous math and ensures that the toxic flood actually results in total, irreversible nullification. It's not just thinking no, it's architecturally forcing the internal world to comply with that decision.
It's the difference, perhaps, between hoping the parasite starves or leaves on its own and actively engineering and deploying a targeted poison that makes its continued presence physiologically or architecturally impossible. It's an active engineered solution. #outro.
So we kicked off this deep dive framing conflict as architectural. And we've really journeyed through two distinct blueprints. We went from a model of automated emotional management that's serverless cache, focused on comfort, standardization, but ultimately fragile.
Right, the system that keeps the parasite alive.
To this other model, one of hardened, intentional complexity, the self-designed cluster, prioritizing sovereignty, even weaponizing stress.
Built for robustness and resolution.
And this entire journey, this architectural upgrade, it all culminates in that sovereign, decisive, even lethal declaration of no, symbolized by that Action 110 and the firing of the arrow.
And the model really does provide, I think, a robust engineered framework. It's backed by concepts from neuroscience, from systems theory, even physics of intention. The distinction it draws is stark and clear. The system relying on standardized external buffers is inherently fragile and remains permanently vulnerable to these parasitic loops. Whereas the system that is consciously designed or adapted and hardened through deliberate exposure to complexity, the self-designed cluster, it gains the capacity to nullify simpler parasitic systems that depend on predictable outputs. That distinction, serverless versus self-designed, it really defines two fundamentally different approaches, not just to stress, but to human resilience, agency, and sovereignty.
It really reframes the goal.
Yeah.
It's not about managing a headache indefinitely. It's about designing and deploying a kill switch for the very system that creates the headache and declaring an irreversible end to that parasitic relationship.
Precisely. So maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to connect this back to daily experience. Remember the core idea. The Ouroboros feeds on the metabolic waste of that internal deliberation, the self-justification, the rumination.
The stuff we often just call thinking.
Right. So maybe ask yourself, what daily, seemingly minor conflicts or stresses in your life are you currently managing via a serverless cache? Maybe through habitual, automated coping mechanisms, checking your phone, having that extra drink, endlessly scrolling. Are you inadvertently keeping a small parasite alive, feeding it that predictable, low-grade stress?
And the flip side.
What would a definitive, maybe painful, but ultimately sovereign cache override look like for you in that situation? What would happen if you didn't buffer it, if you took the raw input? And what kind of complex, high-potency data, what kind of internal power or insight might that unleash, even if it feels destabilizing at first? Think about that complexity. What could you build with it?
Welcome to The Debate. Today we're examining a really interesting model of cognitive architecture. It's one specifically engineered, it seems, for achieving emotional sovereignty and, importantly, nullifying stress. Now, this framework is remarkable, not just for its conceptual power, but also for the dual way its principles are communicated.
That duality is fascinating, isn't it? Because on one hand, the source material uses this very accessible, almost you could say therapeutic narrative, the story of the mighty lion and the naive cup. But then at the same time, it really insists on this rigorous scientific structure. It defines its components using these highly technical terms like serverless cache and sovereign complexity.
Right. And this kind of dual presentation brings us straight to our central question for today. Which explanatory style is fundamentally more essential for the successful transmission and, crucially, the effective application of this model? Now, I'm going to contend that the metaphorical approach, the narrative part, is primarily because it provides that necessary pathway for immediate accessibility and, I think, practical therapeutic efficacy.
And I'm approaching this more from the perspective of, let's say, longevity and validation. I believe the model's endurance, its real power, rests entirely on its provable foundation, so therefore I'll be arguing for the primacy of the scientific approach. I want to emphasize that its transdisciplinary rigor provides the necessary proof and the technical depth, without which the metaphor risks becoming, just a pleasant fiction, perhaps. So let me try and establish the case for rigor first. The model's credibility, I think we can agree, is entirely dependent on its validity. Its validity as an engineered, robust, transdisciplinary framework. If we just strip away the technical language and only focus on the story, we risk reducing it to maybe unvalidated self-help. The scientific approach uses precise technical terminology. These terms like serverless cache, low arousal homeostasis, and cache override. Now, these aren't used just to sound complicated, but very specifically to connect the architecture of the model to established, externally validated concepts. For instance, we've previously established links to frameworks like the Yerkes-Dodson law. So the serverless cache isn't just a metaphor, it represents a recognized psychological structure for processing emotional data flow. Furthermore, this rigor is absolutely necessary, I'd say indispensable, to provide the detail for the nullification sequence. The technical language explains that the decisive action of the lion produces the source calls it a pure, uncut, high-potency emotional payload, meaning, high-fidelity, overwhelming emotional energy, and that this leads to a buffer overflow in the parasitic system. That technical specificity validates the mechanism. It confirms it operates based on an engineering logic, not just brave feelings.
Okay, I fully agree that rigor is vital. I wouldn't dispute that. But I would argue that your scientific style, while clearly necessary for validation, it remains kind of inert until it's made actionable. And the metaphorical style, that's the necessary vehicle for the foundational learning, for the internalization. It's really the application pathway that ensures the user can actually execute the complex mechanism that the science describes. And this style achieves its goal through, well, quite brilliant pedagogical design, I think. It translates these really dense concepts, like the serverless cache architecture, and the end goal, the self-designed cluster, into immediately relatable characters. You mentioned them, the naive cup and the mighty lion. The source material even suggests these metaphors are deployed by the Lego therapist specifically to explain this robust architecture to younger audiences, maybe even a 5-year-old.
So this isn't just simplification. It's translating complex architecture into behavior. And when we internalize the model this way, the core ideas become essentially the behavior of a hero. The vivid imagery, things like the annoying dog, the Ouroboros, that perpetually eats tiny worries and stress, and then the lion's definitive action of, quote, throwing the dog off the cliff. That imagery teaches powerful principles. Principles like focused intent, yi, and the principle of irreversibility. A dry technical definition of entropy offloading just cannot achieve the visceral learning, the felt sense that this heroic narrative provides.
Provides, yes. I see why you emphasize actionability, but let's get back to the most critical action here, the nullification sequence itself. This is precisely where the scientific framework provides that indispensable detail that, I'd argue, the metaphor kind of glosses over. The efficacy of nullification depends crucially on the mechanism, and the user really needs to understand the intelligence behind the strategy. The listener needs to grasp the engineering detail, that the lion uses what the model calls its vigorous math. Now, that's used to turn those raw, high-potency feelings not just into, aggressive bravery, but specifically into targeting data and fuel. The framework explains that the result is a strategic overwhelming of the parasite's digestion algorithm, and this happens through the calculated application of sovereign complexity. Now, if the user just visualizes throwing the dog off the cliff, they risk simplifying this complex cognitive strategy down to, maybe mere emotional outburst, and they lose the detailed intelligence required for a precise cache override.
Well, I'm not entirely convinced that the calculation part is the most difficult step for the user. I think the metaphorical representation is precisely what overcomes the hesitation. It's what makes the action possible in the first place. I mean, you can know the equation perfectly, right? But if you lack the conviction, the will to execute, the mechanism just remains theoretical data. The focus, in practice, I believe, must be on the arrow of intent, yi, which is fundamentally about the smooth, unswerving, focused will of the archer. The scientific terms are just data points. They're the coordinates, if you will, until the lion's choice is visualized as a decisive final act. The metaphor of the lion, stubbing out the automatic lid of the naive cup, that provides the necessary psychological commitment for the user to make the action final and, crucially, irreversible. It translates the, let's be honest, dry calculation of the buffer overflow into a committed internal declaration. And maybe let's shift for a moment to the model structure, the architectural translation. Here, the metaphor is, I think, peerless in demonstrating the pedagogical path from, let's say, inherent human fragility to engineered cognitive strength. Just consider the contrast between the naive cup and the mighty lion. The cup represents that fragile, externally dependent state. It's relying on that automatic lid just to maintain stability, which, as you correctly identified, corresponds to low arousal homeostasis. But the mighty lion, by contrast, isn't born that way. It's built. It's built through training, like custom interlocking Legos, as the source says. This structural clarity, this narrative, allows the user to internalize the transformation, moving from a state where they're constantly being managed or sort of nibbled at by the annoying dog toward becoming the self-designed cluster, that heroic developmental narrative. Well, it feels like the only truly effective way to teach structural change and self-authorship.
Okay. I do acknowledge the pedagogical power of that cup-to-line narrative. It's effective. However, that narrative absolutely requires grounding in precise concepts. Otherwise, you risk the model just drifting into soft, perhaps unvalidated storytelling. We have to ensure the framework retains its transdisciplinary rigor. I mean, the very reason the naive cup works so well as a metaphor is because it is anchored to the concept of low arousal homeostasis. That's a clinically understood state of managed stability, yes, but one that's inherently brittle under significant load. Without that scientific definition anchoring it, the lion risks becoming just a fictional hero, with maybe no basis in validated cognitive structures. If we prioritize the appealing character over the architecture it represents, well, then we dilute the model's foundation and its critical connection to systems theory. The story explains what the lion does. The science explains why the lion is able to do it consistently and robustly. And this rigor becomes paramount when defining core functions like irreversibility. The scientific framework affords us precision by linking this concept directly to the model's function of offloading stress or entropy. The nullification sequence, when you view it scientifically, turns a chaotic, lingering, entropic problem into a clean, decisive, solved past event. It's done. This mathematical precision, this idea that the process is guaranteed, which confirms the model is genuinely engineered, that precision is lost if we only focus on the feeling of commitment from the story.
I agree on the importance of that engineered finality, absolutely. But the application of that engineered principle, it's best taught, internalized, and crucially, practiced through the narrative. I mean, how does a user faced with a sudden spike in emotional data, how do they recall the precise equation for entropy offloading in that moment? They don't. They recall the decisive image. The practice of irreversibility is, I think, masterfully laid out through the 3 Chinese arrow philosophies that are actually part of the metaphor. The image of the arrow that cannot be called back, the one that follows the arrow of Tao, that provides the smooth, unswerving course of focused action necessary for successful practice. It reinforces the finality of the nullification sequence, that the action is a final, clean declaration of no, which is powerfully codified by the visual symbol 110.
So the philosophical and visual guidance embedded in the metaphor facilitates the practice of the rigorous concept, like entropy offloading, far more effectively, I'd argue, than merely defining the concept mathematically. The metaphor makes the engineering human, makes it usable.
Look, I fundamentally stand by the necessity of the engineering description. You focus on the experience of the archer, the feeling, but I focus on the physics of the arrow, so to speak. Without the underlying physics, the archer is just, well, hoping. This model is valuable because it is structurally sound. And that soundness, that reliability, is only truly conveyed through the scientific framework.
And yet, the structurally sound model remains locked away, theoretical, until the narrative provides the key for its actual use. So, to summarize my perspective, while the technical detail from the scientific framework is, yes, crucial for validation and intellectual rigor, it's the pedagogical power of the metaphor creating the mighty lion as a therapeutic exemplar, providing accessible, vivid principles like focused intent, yi. That's what truly facilitates the model's internalization and application in the real world. The metaphor is the engine, really, that converts abstract theory into applied emotional sovereignty.
And I maintain that the operational value, the core strength of the model, relies fundamentally on the scientific framework providing that validation and the necessary technical detail. Without the precise terminology, for example, defining the action as releasing a pure, uncut, high-potency emotional payload, and confirming that the entire model is robust and engineered, the therapeutic narrative, however appealing, becomes intellectually hollow. It lacks the necessary foundation to stand as a reliable, transdisciplinary cognitive tool, especially when facing, say, academic scrutiny.
Well, it does seem quite clear, listening to both sides, that the robust power of this cognitive model, at least as it's presented in the source material, is ultimately derived from the fact that both explanatory styles are, in fact, mutually supportive.
Yes, I think I have to agree on that necessary point of convergence. The rigor of the science must provide the evidence. It validates the framework, connects it to established theory. But equally, the narrative clarity of the metaphor has to provide that accessible pathway for practical application. Ultimately, it seems both styles uniquely illuminate essential but quite different aspects required for any listener seeking true and lasting emotional sovereignty.
Hello there! I see you have a very important building project today. So, think of me as your personal Lego therapist. Together, we're going to use some amazing conceptual bricks to build a story. A story about how your brain can become the strongest kind of hero you can imagine. Ready? Let's get into it.
That's right. This isn't just about passively watching something. Nope. This is about building. We are going to construct a really powerful metaphor for how you can manage those nagging, persistent stresses and become, well, truly in charge of your own emotional world. This whole session is designed just for you. So let's get our first pieces on the board. All right, so every great hero's journey starts with a problem, right? And our story, well, it begins with a very special kind of cup. A cup that's meant to hold our feelings, but it has this constant, really annoying problem. So let's meet our starting character. Okay, so here it is, the naive cup. It's soft, it's a little unsteady, and its whole job is to hold our feelings. Now, to keep from spilling over with anxiety, it depends on this automatic lid. In tech terms, you could call it a serverless cache. It's basically an out-of-the-box solution that just instantly muffles any stress signals to keep things quiet. What is this in real life? Oh, it's that knee-jerk habit of just bottling things up, or quickly changing the subject, or just pretending a problem isn't there, all to avoid that wobbly feeling. And this is the problem. Meet the annoying dog. He's a little stress vampire. Its more technical name is the Ouroboros. The snake that eats its own tail, because it's a self-feeding, looping problem. See, it doesn't want some big emotional meal. No. It thrives by feeding on the tiny, processed worries that are always leaking out from under that automatic lid. It's a pest you can manage, sure, but it's always there, just keeping that whole cycle going. So here it is, the core conflict, all laid out. On one side, you've got the fragile, wobbly cup, just desperately trying to stay quiet by pushing everything down. And on the other, you have the annoying dog, which is literally kept alive by the very system that's trying to create that quiet. It's a perfect parasitic relationship, and you know what? It's absolutely exhausting. But here's the turning point. This is the moment where everything could change. What if the cup just got sick and tired of being wobbly and dependent? What if it decided to stop just managing a pest and instead decided to completely rebuild itself into something truly powerful? And that brings us to part 2. It's time to build. We are leaving that wobbly cup behind. It's time to construct the mighty lion, a robust, sovereign hero, built piece by intentional piece. This is where the real transformation begins. So meet the mighty lion. In our metaphor, this is the self-designed cluster. Now, unlike that prepackaged wobbly cup, the lion is strong, it's solid, and it's built through intentional training. It's like using custom Legos to create exactly the hero you need. Its strength comes from the inside. This is the person who's faced adversity and decided, I'm going to build resilience, strength, and self-awareness from the ground up. Now, the lion's very first move is also its most courageous one. It's called the cache override. It reaches up and it breaks off that automatic lid. It makes the conscious choice to stop suppressing feelings and instead to face them, to feel them directly. This is a massive, game-changing first step.
Okay, so the lid is gone. The lion is ready. It is time for the climax of our story, the most potent, definitive strategy for dealing with that annoying dog once and for all. This is called the nullification sequence.
It all comes down to this single, powerful moment of decision. The dog comes sniffing around, expecting its usual little drip feed of processed worry. But the lion looks it dead in the eyes and decides, no. And this no isn't just a word. It is a fundamental, total rewrite of the rules of the game.
So how does the lion do it? It's a devastatingly effective 3-step process. 1. Raw power. The lion takes all that raw feeling, the fear, the anger, and instead of wobbling, it does some, quote, vigorous math, turning it all into targeting data and pure fuel. 2. Toxic flood. It unleashes the entire pure, uncut emotional payload right at the dog. No more tiny little sips. And 3. Nullification. This raw, weaponized emotion is just, it's too complex. It's too much for the simple parasite to handle.
And the result? It's total victory. The annoying dog's simple little system gets way more data than it could possibly handle. In computer science, we'd call this a fatal buffer overflow. It crashes, it gets deleted, it vanishes forever. The lion didn't suffer more by feeling its emotions. It just used their full power, intelligently.
This powerful, targeted action, this big no, it's like firing an arrow. It's not a debate. It's not a struggle. It is a single, decisive, final action that completely and utterly resolves the problem.
But how the lion fires this arrow is just as important as the arrow itself. See, this action reveals 3 ancient, powerful secrets rooted in Chinese philosophy. So let's move to our final part and unlock some of this incredible wisdom.
Okay, the first secret is the arrow of intent, or yi. Here's the idea. The power isn't in the action itself, but in the focused will behind it. Before the lion even moves a muscle, it has already used its sharp mind to decide exactly what needs to happen. Think of an athlete visualizing the perfect shot before they even take it. It's about creating this biological state of pure focus, where your actions become incredibly precise and powerful.
Secret number 2 is the arrow of Dao, or the path. The lion's action is like a river flowing downhill. It just follows the most natural, efficient path. There's no wasted energy on second-guessing or self-doubt. It's that feeling of being in the zone, right? Where the right action feels almost effortless and totally unswerving, because it is simply the clearest path to solving the problem.
And finally, the arrow of time and irreversibility. And this one is so crucial. Once that arrow is fired, the action is done. You can't call it back. By taking this final, irreversible action, the lion transforms a chaotic, ongoing problem into a clean, solved past event. The stress is just offloaded for good.
And with that, our building project is complete. We've taken the pieces of a wobbly cup and we've rebuilt them into a mighty lion. We've seen how to turn raw feeling into focused fuel and take decisive, final action. So now, the only question left is the one right here on the screen. What hero will you build next?